All right, next we're going to look at the demand curve that a monopolist faces. So with perfect competition, we saw that the perfectly competitive firm's demand curve was just a perfectly elastic horizontal demand curve equal to the price determined by market equilibrium. It's not going to be the case for monopoly because monopolies are not price takers, they are actually price makers. And the demand curve that they face is the entire industry or market demand because they are the only seller. Okay, so quite different from what we saw previously. So again, recall that under perfect competition, firms are price takers. They're so small relative to the rest of the market because there's so many sellers. They can't influence the price in any way. They just have to take the market equilibrium price as given, right? So they're price takers. And it's the forces of market supply and market demand that determine the price. We also saw with perfect competition that marginal revenue is the same as average revenue is the same as price, right? So all three of those things are identical. That's not the case with monopoly. And also recall what our definition of marginal revenue is. It's the change in total revenue given a 1 unit change in quantity produced and sold, right? So if I produce and sell 1 more unit, how much money is that going to make for me as a company? That's marginal revenue. So let's think about, let's compare and contrast perfect competition and monopoly. The perfect competitor doesn't have to worry about lowering price to try to sell more. They can sell as much as they want or as much as they're able to at the market price, right? That's why they face a horizontal, perfectly elastic demand curve. And in a purely competitive situation, this is basically because the firm accounts for such a small part of the market. It can sell all of its output, whatever its profit maximizing output is. It can sell all of that at the market price. Whereas with the monopolist, it kind of faces a trade-off between price and the quantity that it can sell, right? So it faces a downward sloping demand curve, which means that if it wants to sell more, it has to lower the price. So that's a trade-off, right? Because recall that total revenue is price times quantity. And if these things are moving in opposite directions, well, it's not exactly, in other words, there's a trade-off, right? Yeah, you can lower your price to sell more, but you're selling each unit at a lower price, okay? Okay, so graphically, of course, this is the difference between perfect competition on the left and a monopoly demand curve on the right. And just to summarize the differences real quick, monopoly, single seller, as opposed to perfect competition where there's many sellers. The monopoly faces the entire industry or market demand curve, whereas the perfectly competitive firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve that is flat and horizontal. The monopoly has to lower its price in order to sell more, whereas a perfectly competitive firm just has to produce more to sell more, and it can sell any of those units at the same price. And then with monopoly, not all units are sold for the same price necessarily, and this is mainly because marginal revenue is less than price, as well as the fact that they might be able to price discriminate, which we'll talk about in a bit. Whereas with perfectly competitive firms, all units are sold for the same price. Price equals marginal revenue. So again, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, which is essentially its average revenue curve, which means it cannot just charge any price without a change in quantity also happening at the same time, right? So this is sometimes a misconception. The monopoly can't just charge whatever price it wants. It has to take into consideration that it faces a demand curve, and it still has to operate under the law of demand, which says that as price goes down, quantity goes up, or I guess maybe a better way to think about it with monopoly, since they people tend to think that they charge really high prices. As price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. So if they try to jack up their price, they're not going to sell as much, right? Okay. So what's really going on here with revenue, right? As far as this goes with the demand curve. So we can think about the monopoly charging a price of $8, and if it charged $8, it would sell 3 units. In this case, we're thinking about ferry crossings. So that might be a good example of a monopoly, a ferry boat that crosses the river and there's no competitors. Okay, so if the ferry operator charges $8, it can sell 3 crossings, ferry crossings. And so to get total revenue, we would multiply 3 times the price, which is 8. So remember, price times quantity, which is basically this rectangle here. Here, that's total revenue. The area of that rectangle is total revenue. Now the monopolist, this ferry operator, might be thinking, dang, I really want to sell more. I think if I was able to sell another ride, another ferry crossing, I might be able to make more money. But if they're smart, they know that the only way to do that is by lowering their price, right? So say they go from selling at $8 to selling at $7. Well, okay, great. Now they can sell 4 ferry crossings, okay? And now this area from 4 to 0 multiplied by 7, so 7 times 4, this area here is their revenue once they drop price to $7. And there's 2 effects of that, okay? So there's basically a price effect. What happens, how does their revenue change, right, as they drop the price? Well, there's 2 effects. There's the price effect, so they lose some revenue because they're now selling at a lower price. And so they were selling those first 3 units at $8. Now they're selling them at $7, so they lose $3 as a result of that. But because they sell an additional unit as a result of lowering their price, they gain $7 from selling that extra unit, and that's the output or quantity effect. So there's a reduction in revenue from the price effect, but there's an increase in revenue from the quantity or output effect, and the overall or net effect is positive 4, right? So they lose 3 from the price effect, they gain 7 from the quantity effect, and so they overall gain $4. And so the monopolist made a good decision here by dropping price to $7. They're going to make a little bit more money. Let me take a step back real quick. And so graphically, also, we can calculate marginal revenue using this. So the marginal revenue here is $4, which is just area A minus area B here. So that's what marginal revenue looks like graphically. All right, so here's another question for you. If a monopoly raises its price, what's going to happen to quantity demanded? Well, you should know this already from chapter 3, right? The law of demand says that if price goes up, what happens to quantity demanded? It goes down, right? So remember how consumers respond to price changes, and you should be familiar with this. You yourself are a consumer. This shouldn't be hard for you, hopefully. What would you do if somebody increased the price of something you regularly bought? Would you buy more or would you buy less? You'd probably buy less, right? I'd be willing to bet money on it. Okay, so recall, right, that the monopolist is the only seller in the market or the industry, and they're selling something that has no close substitutes, right? So you can't just switch to something else very easily. So think of some imperfect substitutes, perhaps. Now, the demand curve is sloping downward because individuals compare marginal satisfaction to cost. This is what we learned in the chapter on consumer choice, right? Where consumers are equalizing the bang for their buck that they get, right? So if there's a price change, there's 2 things going on, actually, right? There's the substitution effect, and there's also the income effect. So price changes are going to change how people consume relative to substitutes, right? If something gets more expensive, I'm going to substitute towards cheaper goods. Although that's not going to be a huge impact here because there are no close substitutes. But we do still have the income effect. So when a price goes up, you're effectively poorer because you can't buy as much of that thing with the same amount of money. So just recall that from the chapter on consumer choice. And of course, this is because consumers have limited incomes but unlimited wants, something that's quite a bit of a review. And so the market demand curve, which the monopolist alone faces by itself, nobody else, it doesn't share it with anybody, it slopes downwards because the individuals compare the marginal satisfaction they get to the price or the cost of the good, and then also recall that the more that a consumer purchases or consumes, the less additional utility the next unit gives them, right? Diminishing marginal utility. So all of these things working together are why the demand curve is downward sloping.